Picture this. You are standing on a beach in the first century.
Wow.
The sun is just beating down, the sand is incredibly hot, and you are surrounded by this massive, chaotic crowd of people who are just, pressing forward, totally desperate for attention.
Yeah, a real mob scene.
Exactly. And there are no blackboards here, there are no visual aids, no carefully printed syllabi handed out at the door, and definitely no public address system.
Just lots of noise and heat.
Right. There's just a single man. And he's waded out and climbed into a small fishing boat just to, get a few feet of physical distance from this crushing crowd on the shoreline. And from that boat, he just sits down to speak.
It is basically the absolute antithesis of the modern educational environment. I mean, we are so used to structured learning, right? Controlled acoustics, curated audiences where everyone is supposed to be there.
Oh, totally. Like a quiet lecture hall.
Yeah, but this scenario is completely unorthodox. It's raw, it's loud, and the audience is entirely unvetted. Anyone could just walk up.
Welcome, learner, to today's custom-tailored deep dive. Our mission today is to decode the instructional methods of history's most famous and arguably most unorthodox teacher, Jesus of Nazareth.
That's a fascinating topic.
It really is. And to do this, we are pulling from a really interesting stack of sources you provided us. We've got a transcript of an audio lecture by David Pawson analyzing Mark chapter 4, and that's paired with a structured study guide that breaks down the exact same text.
And just to clarify, we are really looking past the theology today to examine the actual mechanics of his primary teaching tool. We want to understand not just, the content of what he taught, but the architectural vehicle he used to deliver it to that chaotic crowd.
Because it worked, right?
It worked incredibly well. We want to know why that specific vehicle was so remarkably effective in an age long before mass media or the internet.
Right. The goal of this deep dive isn't just some historical retrospective. We want to figure out how the structure of his teaching applies directly to how you, the listener, consume information today in a world of just, constant digital noise.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand his method, we have to look at his primary tool, which is the parable. And before we can even understand the specific stories, we actually need to completely debunk what most people think a parable even is.
Oh, for sure. People often come to these historical texts with a very hazy, almost childish idea of what a parable is supposed to do.
I know, I definitely did.
Right. The Pawson lecture tackles this misconception head-on, noting that we tend to conflate parables with fables.
Yeah, you hear the word parable and you immediately think of, Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare.
Exactly.
It's a cute little story designed to deliver this neat, easily digestible moral lesson at the end. The source material actually describes that modern approach perfectly. It says it's like using a spoonful of sweet jam to make a bitter moral pill go down smoothly.
A very Mary Poppins approach to teaching.
Right. But based on our sources, a parable is definitely not that. If I had to put it into a modern analogy, I'd say a parable is actually like a password-protected file.
Oh, like that?
Yeah, the story itself is the encrypted file, but your personal sincerity, your actual genuine desire to learn the truth, is the password.
That's a great way to put it, because Pawson goes much deeper than the whole story with a moral definition. He offers two specific definitions that completely reframe how we should read these texts.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, he argues that a parable is a mirror. It is not a window looking out at some pleasant abstract idea. It is a mirror held up, often at a very uncomfortable angle, to show the listener their true self.
And, looking in a hyper-accurate mirror is rarely a comfortable experience for anyone.
No, it's usually pretty confronting. The source uses the famous story of the prodigal son to illustrate this.
Oh, everyone knows that one.
Right. In modern culture, we tend to focus entirely on the first half of the story. The younger brother wastes his inheritance, hits rock bottom, comes home, and the father throws this lavish party to celebrate his return.
It's a nice, heartwarming redemption arc.
Exactly. But Pawson points out that the actual primary target of that parable was the elder brother.
The one who stayed home.
Yes. The elder brother represented the self-righteous religious leaders who were standing right there in the crowd listening to the story. They were the ones who were absolutely furious that grace was being extended to people they deemed unworthy.
This detail from the lecture really stood out to me. Pawson mentions this BBC dramatization of the prodigal son that ended with this super heartwarming, happily ever after moment.
Oh, right, where they sanitized the ending.
Yeah. The older brother basically says, "Sorry, Dad, I'll come in and join the party." But the source points out that Historically, culturally, and texturally, the elder brother's reaction to his father's grace was basically, I'll kill you for this.
Yeah, it's visceral.
That is a violently sharp mirror to hold up to an audience of very powerful religious leaders.
It attacks their complacency directly. It's brilliant, but dangerous. But then Pawson introduces his second, deeper definition of a parable. And what's fascinating here is the absolute paradox of it.
Oh.
He says a parable is a mystery. And in the biblical context, a mystery isn't like an unsolvable riddle or a murder mystery. It is a secret that is deliberately hidden until the right time and then revealed to the right people.
Deliberately hidden.
Yes, the lecture claims Jesus deliberately used parables to hide the truth from certain people while simultaneously revealing it to others.
Which honestly feels incredibly counterintuitive for anyone calling themselves a teacher. I mean, your entire job is supposed to be making complex things clear to everyone, not intentionally obscuring them.
It seems totally counterproductive until you remember the specific dynamics of the crowd on that beach we talked about.
Right, the chaotic mob.
Exactly. It was a totally mixed, uncurated audience. You had a very small fraction of people who were genuinely seeking truth.
Yeah.
But the vast majority were either just curious bystanders, because, a crowd always draws a crowd,
Sure.
or they were people who just wanted to see a miracle, magic trick, or get a physical healing. The teacher had no physical way to, bounce the insincere people out of the venue. There are no bouncers on the beach. Right. So, according to Pawson, the parable acted as an automatic sorting mechanism.
Which brings us right back to the password protective file analogy.
Exactly.
If you were sincere and you were actually willing to change your life based on new information, you leaned in, you stayed after, you had follow-up questions, and you got the password.
You unlock the file.
Yeah. But if you were just apathetic or you were only there for the spectacle, the truth was hidden right in plain sight. You just heard a mildly entertaining story about first-century farming practices and went home completely unbothered, totally unaware of the deeper claim.
It sorted the audience dynamically without a single person having to leave the beach. The teacher was dealing with a massive crowd that essentially wanted him to be a doctor and an entertainer.
They wanted a show.
They wanted physical health and spectacle. But his stated mission was to preach, to fundamentally change their minds and their hearts.
And that tension between what an audience demands and what a communicator knows they actually need is still a massive hurdle today. It's the eternal struggle of literally every creator, writer, and leader.
Oh, absolutely.
And the study guide outlines how this specific text addresses the major universal criticisms of verbal instruction. Like, the first massive critique of simply talking to an audience is that words just don't last.
Right, they just fade away.
The complaint is that verbal teaching has no permanent effect. People get emotional, they get super inspired by a good speech for about 5 minutes, and then they go home, open their inbox, and forget everything.
It's the ancient critique that verbal instruction is nothing more than writing on water. To answer this skepticism, the text presents the famous parable of the sower.
Let's get into it.
A farmer scatters seed. Some falls on a hard path, where the birds immediately eat it. Some falls on shallow, rocky ground. It springs up fast but dies quickly in the sun because it has no root system.
Okay.
Some falls among thorns and gets choked out. And finally, some falls on good soil and produces a massive harvest.
I have to pause and push back on the literal math of this story, though.
Oh, the math is terrible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because looking at it from a modern efficiency standpoint, the seed falls on 4 different types of ground, and only 1 out of the 4 actually produces a crop. That is a 25% success rate.
Which sounds awful.
If I am a teacher or a marketer and I have a 25% retention rate for my core message, I'm calling an emergency meeting because my methodology is completely broken. That seems like an abysmal return on investment.
The math absolutely looks like a failure until you shift your perspective to the core argument of the parable, which is the fault does not lie with the seed. The source material argues that the seed, which represents the truth being taught, is perfectly potent and viable. The failure is entirely due to the reception given by the soil. The failure belongs to the listener.
So it's basically an indictment of the condition of the audience's heart or mind?
Precisely.
I want to zero in on one of those failed soils in particular, though, the thorny ground.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one.
Because the source material frames this specific failure through a lens that feels aggressively modern. The study guide describes the thorns as the cares of this world and the desire for other things. It calls it a mind divided by worldly concerns.
Yes.
When I read that, all I see is pure modern FOMO. the fear of missing out.
The psychological parallel is striking, isn't it? The source explicitly notes that it isn't necessarily evil things that choke out the seed. It is often the relentless pursuit of too many good things.
Yes. If you fill your daily life with a million micro commitments, a million distractions, you literally do not have the cognitive bandwidth left for deep work or deep truth.
You just spread too thin.
Exactly. If you are constantly terrified of missing out on any social experience, any cultural trend, or any digital notification, you end up choking the most important foundational truth before they can ever establish roots in your life.
And the farmer, the teacher, cannot control that cognitive overload in the soil. But returning to your pushback on the 25% success rate, Posson explains why the teacher doesn't actually view this as a failure.
Okay, why not?
The secret lies in the exponential return of the good soil. The text claims the good soil yields 30, 60, or even 100 times what was sown.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that exponential multiplication completely dwarfs the seed lost to the hard, shallow, or thorny ground.
So the math actually does work out in the end.
It does.
And the lecture backs this up with some wild historical anecdotes to prove what a 100-fold return actually looks like in practice, like the story of Willie Mullen.
Yes, Posson cites the historical case of Willie Mullen to illustrate this exact exponential math. Mullen was an Irish boy who lived rough and eventually became the leader of a violent gang.
Okay, so a really tough audience.
The toughest. One night, almost by chance, he wandered into a tent where an evangelist was conducting this grueling 3-week-long speaking crusade.
And the speaker had zero idea that an actual gang leader was sitting in the back of the tent.
He had no clue. In fact, that speaker later concluded that his entire 3-week crusade was a complete miserable failure.
Because he didn't see any immediate results.
Right. He didn't record a single convert during that whole time. He thought every single word he spoke had just bounced off hard ground. But he had unknowingly planted a tiny seed in Willie Mullen's mind.
And it stuck.
It did. Sometime later, while Willie was literally in the middle of planning a robbery with his gang, that dormant seed finally germinated.
It was just sitting there waiting for the right internal environment to sprout.
Exactly. It triggered a profound paradigm shift. Willie Mullen abandoned his criminal life and went on to become a speaker himself, eventually leading thousands of people to the exact same faith.
Thousands from one seed.
Yes. And years later, Willie managed to track down that original speaker, who was by then on his deathbed, and told him the story.
Oh, wow.
The dying man finally realized his quote-unquote failed crusade was actually his most mathematically successful one, because that single seed yielded a 1,000-fold return.
That is incredible. And the second anecdote in the lecture is even heavier, I think, and it deals with an extreme version of this delayed reaction.
The Ethiopian story.
Right. Posson talks about a foreign missionary laboring in a very remote, isolated village in Ethiopia just prior to World War II. After years of exhausting work, he saw exactly one person respond to his teaching.
Just one.
Just one single blind beggar. And then the geopolitical landscape violently shifted. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in the 1930s. The Italian troops used mustard gas, conquered the region, and expelled every single foreign teacher and missionary.
So the man was forced to return home, believing his entire life's work had amounted to reaching just one marginalized beggar.
Yeah, talk about feeling like a failure. But the story doesn't end there. He couldn't return to Ethiopia until the late 1940s, after the war. And when he finally made it back to that specific region, he discovered that in his absence, that one blind beggar had taught others, who then taught others.
That exponential growth again.
Exactly. The source claims he returned to find a thriving community of 3,000 people waiting for him. The argument Posson is making here is that when the seed hits good soil, it is virtually indestructible, and its math is entirely exponential.
Which brings us to a massive psychological hurdle for anyone trying to teach, lead, or learn today. We are a species utterly obsessed with visible, instant metrics.
Oh, 100%. We want dashboards showing real-time growth.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because even if you are that good soil, and even if the math is exponential, you almost never see the results right away.
Rarely ever.
The source highlights this as the second major criticism of teaching. It appears to have no visible effect. My analogy for this human impatience is, it's like taking a daily multivitamin and then immediately running to the bathroom to stare in the mirror, waiting to look healthier.
That's hilarious, but it's so true.
We crave instant visible proof that the input is changing the output.
We demand immediate validation. The text actually addresses this anxiety with the parable of the growing seed.
Let's hear it.
A man scatters seed on the ground, And then he just goes to sleep and gets up day after day. The seed sprouts and grows, and the text specifically notes, he knows not how.
He has no idea what's happening underground.
Exactly. The entire theological and practical weight of this parable rests on a single Greek word used in the original text, which is automatos.
Automatic?
Yes. The earth produces of itself. The seed contains its own active, self-sustaining life force. The growth happens in hidden, gradual stages. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain.
So the farmer just has to wait.
The farmer's role is not to sit in the dirt and scream at the seed to grow faster. His primary jobs are patience and confidence. He does not engineer the cellular growth. He trusts the hidden automatic process.
The power is contained entirely within the seed, not the farmer.
Right.
And Pawson shares this incredible story from London during the Blitz in World War II that perfectly illustrates this indestructible automatos power.
The Harvest Festival story, it's an amazing visual, is the early 1940s, and a church in London had been elaborately decorated with actual agricultural displays.
Like real plants.
Yeah, sheaves of wheat and corn set up for a harvest festival on a Saturday afternoon. But due to strict blackout regulations, the congregation had to abandon the building early.
Because of the air raids.
Exactly. And that very night, during a massive air raid, the church took a direct hit from a German bomb. The building was completely obliterated. It was reduced to rubble, ash, and exposed stone.
Just complete devastation, a total wipeout of the environment.
But the following spring, right in the middle of that charred devastation, a bright green patch began to push through the debris.
Wow.
And by the autumn, there was a perfect, thriving crop of corn growing in the exact shape of the ruined platform where the pulpit used to be.
That's almost hard to believe.
It's incredible. The raw seeds from the festival decorations had been blown into the rubble by the explosion. The bombing actually cleared the canopy and exposed the soil, allowing the germinating power of that seed to take over.
So you can bomb the building, you can banish the teacher, but you literally cannot stop the automatos, the automatic growth of the seed once it makes contact with the soil.
It serves as a profound defense against the despair of not seeing immediate, visible results from your efforts.
Okay, so we have established that the seed's growth is permanent, and we see that it operates automatically. But that leads to the final critique of this entire endeavor.
The scale problem.
Right. Does any of this actually matter on a macro scale? The criticism is that the results, even if they are real, are just too small. They are politically and historically insignificant.
To answer this, the text presents the parable of the mustard seed.
Okay, set the scene for this one.
Well, we have to look at the physical reality of a mustard seed in the Middle East. If you shake one out of a pod into the palm of your hand, it is just a tiny black speck.
It looks like a grain of dust.
Exactly. It looks entirely useless. It was proverbially the smallest of all the seeds a first-century farmer would have sown.
But the parable says it grows into something massive.
Right. The parable states it grows into the greatest of all shrubs, putting out large branches so that birds can nest in its shade.
Which seems like a bit of an exaggeration for a mustard plant, honestly.
Well, this raises an important question. What did a massive tree actually represent to a first-century listener? Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, we realize this wasn't just a quaint botany lesson.
It wasn't just about a big plant. There was heavy political weight attached to that specific imagery, wasn't there?
Absolutely. In ancient texts, specifically the writings of the prophet Ezekiel, a massive tree with large branches and nesting birds was a widely understood geopolitical metaphor.
Okay.
It represented a massive multinational empire. The Assyrian Empire was described this way. The Roman Empire was commonly viewed this way. It was a massive overarching tree where different client nations and conquered peoples came to find shelter and economic stability, like birds in the branches.
Oh, wow. So let's really paint the picture here. You have a carpenter standing on a dirt beach looking at a ragged, politically oppressed crowd, and he is making an absolutely shocking historical claim.
He really is.
He is saying that his teaching movement, which currently consists of just, what, a handful of marginalized fishermen?
Basically 11 guys.
Right. He's saying that tiny group is that speck of dust. But he is claiming it contains the genetic code for a kingdom that will eventually outgrow and outlast the Roman Empire itself, encompassing all the nations of the earth.
The audacity of the claim is just staggering. He is projecting ultimate, expansive global influence stemming from utter, apparent insignificance.
Okay, we've zoomed way out to the macro level, looking at ancient global empires, but Looking at the end of this study guide, the source material suddenly takes a weird left turn.
It does shift gears pretty fast.
Yeah, it shifts abruptly from massive geopolitical trees to, well, economics. It starts talking about lamps on stands and measuring out grain. How does a lamp connect to a mustard seed?
The transition seems jarring. But Pawson explains that Jesus concludes this masterclass by returning the focus squarely to the ethical and spiritual responsibility of the individual listener.
Bringing it back down to the micro.
Exactly. First, the lamp. You don't bring a lamp into a dark room just to hide it under a bed. The truth you uncover is meant to be revealed and shared, not hoarded.
Makes sense.
But the second principle, the concept of the measure, is the real mechanical core of how we consume information.
The text says, "The measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given you. For to him who has will more be given, and from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away."
Which is a heavy statement.
I read that and it just sounds like the rich getting richer.
It sounds like harsh capitalism, yeah. But Pawson argues this is the ultimate economic law of intellectual and spiritual growth. The measure refers to a measuring basket for grain.
Like a literal bucket.
Right. The text is stating that the exact amount of intentional attentiveness and receptivity you give to the truth directly dictates how much truth you will actually receive in return.
I want to translate this into a modern mechanism because it makes so much sense when you think about it like a social media algorithm.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison.
The measure you give is the exact measure you get back. If you give an algorithm 3 seconds of your attention on a superficial video, it feeds you slightly more superficial content tomorrow.
It learns your habits.
Exactly. But if you give your full attention to a deep, complex topic, the algorithm recalibrates and feeds you an exponential amount of depth in return. Your attention trains the system.
That is a perfect modern parallel. The Pawson lecture compares it to the discipline of being a student. If you give yourself entirely to study, your literal cognitive capacity to learn actually expands. You gain more.
Your bucket gets bigger.
Yes. But if you coast and stop paying attention, you don't just stay stagnant, you actually start forgetting what you already knew. The knowledge erodes.
Use it or lose it, which means having ears to hear isn't about the biological function of your eardrums at all. It is about maintaining a posture of intentional, active reception.
A conscious choice.
Right. The effectiveness of any deep truth is inseparably tied to how the hearer chooses to measure out their attention.
The truth is available, but the listener controls the valve.
Man, we have covered some serious ground today.
We really have.
We started by reframing parables, not as cute fables, but as hidden, sometimes uncomfortable mirrors that diagnose our true selves while acting as a password-protected sorting mechanism for the crowd.
We looked at the math of the good soil, realizing that a 25% hit rate isn't a failure when the return is exponential.
We explored the automatos, the indestructible automatic power of a planted idea to grow even out of the rubble of a bombed church. And we unpacked the massive geopolitical audacity of a tiny mustard seed outlasting the Roman Empire.
And every single piece of that architecture hinges on whether or not the individual listener is willing to provide the good soil and the full measure of their attention.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today, learner. We spent a lot of time talking about that Greek word automatos, the automatic, self-contained power of a good seed to grow on its own once it's planted in your mind.
Yeah.
But if that mechanical principle is true for good seeds, think about the negative seeds. Think about the offhand cynical comments, the toxic ideas, or the outrage bait we passively consume online every single day.
That's a sobering thought.
If good soil multiplies good seed exponentially without us having to force it, what is the automatos of a bad seed? If you let a toxic idea take root, it has its own self-sustaining life force, and it will grow in the dark while you sleep.
It really will.
So the next time you find yourself standing on the beach of information overload, surrounded by the noise of the crowd, be incredibly careful about what you let into your soil. Find the quiet truth, give it your full measure of attention, and let the right seeds grow. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, learner. Keep diagnosing your soil.